Hi everyone, you're on our YouTube channel War and Politics 24. My name is Andrei Drozda and our guest today is Mr. Eric Ciaramella, who's a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Eric, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrei, for having me.
So today we're gonna talk about Trump's trade wars, about United States of America administration trade wars and tariffs against different countries, and about global security and in particular Russian war against Ukraine. So as we know today, Donald Trump decided to increase tariffs against China to some enormous amount and level. And I would like to ask you in the beginning of our conversation, what security challenges actually in the world would be created by Donald Trump's decision to start trade war against China, against the European Union and other countries?
Thanks. So I think on the security side, the implications are twofold. I think the first is, it's injected a huge amount of uncertainty and unpredictability into the international system. And I think the aftershocks of that will be felt for many, many months. But I think the biggest main challenge is that it has created huge divides between the United States and its traditional allies and partners, and even between the allies and partners themselves, as they try to figure out whether to respond by retaliating with similar reciprocal tariffs, or if they try to negotiate some sort of deals. And you're already seeing this debate unfold, for example, in the EU, where you have certain member states that I think are more interested in levying some sort of reciprocal tariff on the United States and sort of fighting fire with fire, as we say, and then others who are more cautious about that and want to preserve their ties to Trump. I'm thinking particularly of Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who I think has advocated more trying to find some sort of common language with Trump and de-escalate the trade war rather than retaliating. And actually, Meloni is coming to Washington in a couple of weeks for a visit at the White House, and so I think that will be kind of her message. But again, with the EU, for example, tariffs and trade policy are set in Brussels. It's not individual member states. And so as much as Trump would probably like to do deals with individual member states that he likes more than others, like Italy at the moment, that's not possible, given that, again, he will have to negotiate, his people will have to negotiate directly with Brussels. So I do think that, just zooming out on the security side, the fact that there has been so much tension injected into the relationship with allies and partners, it's going to make it much more complicated to be solving security challenges like a common position on Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine.
Well, actually, President Trump was very arrogant during his newest speech in the National Republican Congressional Committee dinner in Washington. He even claimed political leaders of other countries who are trying to negotiate with him that they are trying to kiss his ass. They are actually kissing his ass to make those trade deals. And they are dying to make a deal, stressed Donald Trump. In this speech, we can actually watch this piece of his speech in Washington and then continue our conversation.
This is the largest transaction in the history of our country. And don't let some of these politicians go around saying, because I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything. I'll do anything, sir. And then I'll see some rebel Republican, some guy that wants to grandstand, say, I think that Congress should take over negotiations. Let me tell you, you don't negotiate like I negotiate. Congress takes over negotiating. Sell America fast because you're going to go busted.
So that was really arrogant. And Eric, I would like to ask you, what kind of reaction Trump expects from United States trade partners after that speech? Should they pay attention to those words? Should they continue their negotiation? Should they try more to please him and actually kiss his ass and then, get the result they expect from Trump?
I mean, I think comments like that are primarily directed towards a domestic audience in the United States. Trump is trying to counteract the narrative around tariffs, which is that our stock market is almost in free fall. I mean, it's been falling now for the past week. People are starting to get concerned about that, and so I think that's where his sort of really overconfident rhetoric that, he's playing hardball and negotiating with all these other countries. It's coming in order to maybe distract and quell a little bit of concern particularly from Republicans. And again, that's who he was addressing. And he's basically saying to Republicans in Congress, stay in line, don't be weak. I'm the one negotiating. And I think it's just, a sort of a product of the times where, he is the leader of this Republican Party that has broken with a lot of traditional parts of the Republican and conservative ideology, one of which is, free trade and liberal markets and so on. And he's breaking with that and sort of coercing the party to go along with him. And I think that's a bit of why you see the threatening language that he's using against Republicans who are trying to defy him in Congress.
Well, we can see this level of pressure on Donald Trump right now from Republican politicians and from his biggest supporters, as Elon Musk. He even publicly criticizes the tariffs and all this policy Trump trying to impose right now. So, will we see in the next few weeks some deeper division, some split in in Trump's team, and what should we think about Elon Musk's role in the future in this team?
I'm not sure about Elon Musk's role. I think a lot of analysts predicted that there would eventually be some sort of split between them because they're two big personalities, and eventually that Trump would sort of get tired of Elon being sort of referred to as the de facto president and things like that. But I do think you are starting to see some tensions in the administration on tariffs. You have the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who I think would prefer more of a, negotiating sort of strategy rather than just the very belligerent ultimatum-based strategy that I think the White House has pursued to date. But then also you have some Republicans, particularly Republican senators, who are starting to work with Democrats to pull back some of the powers that Congress actually has given to the president to set tariff policies, and say, actually, Congress should reassert its authority over, external trade of the United States and so on. And so I think that, over the next several weeks and months, that's going to be a main story, is the sort of tug of war between the executive branch, which is the president and the executive agencies and department, and the legislative branch in Congress, where there will be some Republicans who want to say, well, we should, play a role here. The question is whether there's enough Republicans, because Trump can always veto any kind of legislation that Congress passes, even in a bipartisan fashion, and then Congress needs a supermajority to overcome a veto, and that's a very, very high bar to meet. So we'll see a bit of that playing out, over the coming weeks, but by and large, for now, the team under Trump is still really unified on the idea of tariffs and sort of this escalating policy of ultimatums.
Well, actually, what do you think? How much time Trump has to show that his policy is really effective and he can, get his goals and reach his goals that he claimed to?
We're in what's called the honeymoon period for a newly elected president, which is typically the first 6, 9, maybe 12 months of a presidency, particularly in this case where Trump has both the House and Senate under Republican control. No one's really talking about the midterm elections, which are, November of 2026 next year. Starting in the beginning of 2026, though, I do think there will be, primaries and campaigns where Republicans in Congress are going to try to put a little bit of distance between them and Trump, assuming that there's some concern about his policies. So I think he probably has this calendar year really as his period of showing that his policies, are successful and can win voters. But he's set a very short timeline for a number of policies. And we've been talking about trade and tariffs, but also we have this timeline about his desire to get a ceasefire in Ukraine. And he set the timeline of 100 days from his inauguration, which is actually later this month in April. And that's a very quick timeline. And hopefully we'll talk a bit more about that. But I think it's pretty unrealistic to expect that. And so, you see already a little recalibration of the narrative that, okay, this is a bit more complicated than we thought. We need a little bit more time. Give us through the end of the spring, maybe the summer. Give us a little bit of flexibility to work on these complicated issues. We're in active negotiations, so on and so forth. But I think by the fall, if there's no results really on tariffs and on major foreign policy issues, a lot of people in his own party will start asking questions. And that's where the pressure needs to come from because, Democrats obviously are asking questions already and they're not on board with his policies, but they don't matter because they don't hold the power in any House and Congress.
So yeah, speaking about Russian and Ukrainian war and Trump's attempts to get a ceasefire, to reach a ceasefire, well, now we see that after all those tariff wars, trade wars, we can see some unexpected consequence that actually oil prices dropped down really hard, and probably the part of it are one of the reasons are Trump's trade wars. The other one are Saudi Arabia and its policy to get more oil and trade more oil on the market. But actually, did Trump really count on this effect that he will drop down the oil price and Russia wouldn't be really happy with that situation, and it will affect Putin's ability to continue war against Ukraine?
Some people in the Trump administration have talked about that as a means to build leverage on Russia, but I don't think that that was Trump's primary objective, with any of the trade policies. I think it's a kind of pleasant silver lining, let's say. But the question is whether the drop in oil prices will be sustained long enough to really put a dent in Russian finances and ability to, continue financing the war. And so if it's just a temporary drop for a few weeks and then it rebounds, it's not really going to have much of an effect. But if it can be sustained throughout the remainder of this year, then I do think, the Russian budget will start to face some significant challenges, again, over the course of probably several to many months.
Okay, so if Trump really wants to get a ceasefire, to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine, what steps his administration should make in the next few weeks? Because now we see that Putin is not going to stop the war. He continues to attack Ukraine, to bomb our cities, and situation is really, really hard. Both sides, both armies on the battlefield are really exhausted right now. But of course, Ukraine can't stop fighting and defend its own land. So it depends on Kremlin's decision and Putin's decision. And so is Trump capable of putting a serious pressure on Russia right now to really get what he promised to do?
I do think that the United States has significant levers that it can pull in order to change the Russian calculus and show Putin that American support for Ukraine is not going away, for example, and that Ukrainian long-term security is sort of a main interest of the United States. Those levers all exist. Whether or not Trump will actually use them, I have more questions because he has not demonstrated over the course of his first term and the beginning of this second term a desire to really use coercive, let's say, and strong measures to put pressure on Russia. And so I think, we have seen a carrots and sticks approach since he took office the second time, but it's been carrots for Russia and sticks for Ukraine. And in my view, that's the wrong, equation. And there needs to be, significant pressure put on the Russians, but also significant incentives for Ukraine. And for Ukraine, I think there needs to be a very clear articulation of a policy that the United States will continue to support Ukraine with military equipment, with training, with intelligence support, in order to help Ukraine rearm and defend itself during a ceasefire period. I think there should be a stronger American position in support of a European, let's call it reassurance force inside Ukraine, not peacekeeping, because that's a separate matter that would have to be dealt with on the line of contact, but some sort of reassurance force like what the UK and the French are talking about. I don't think there will be any American boots on the ground, but I can definitely imagine American enablers and support in the form of logistics, in the form of intelligence support, et cetera. And I think that, Trump has a better chance of reaching some sort of fair deal if he can show Ukraine that the West will continue to have its back even after a ceasefire. And if he can show that same thing to Putin and say, Ukraine's future security is not up for negotiation. We can talk about the modalities of a ceasefire, but the West will continue to provide the equipment, the training, the intelligence support, and the presence on the ground that is necessary to secure Ukraine during a ceasefire and deter Russia from launching another attack. I think those ingredients are there. Those tools are at his disposal. Whether he decides to use them in that way, I haven't seen any evidence for it. I certainly hope so, but we'll have to see.
It's really hard to imagine that one day we can hear such kind of rhetoric from Trump's administration that we're gonna rearm Ukraine, support Ukraine by weaponry, by ammunition, and now we can hear totally opposite things from Pete Hegseth and other Trump defense advisors, security advisors, and so on. Right now we can even observe that Trump's administration is trying to withdraw American military forces from the eastern flank of NATO, from Baltic states, from Poland. What kind of sign is it for Kremlin when in Moscow, Putin and his fellows and his team, they see that Trump is withdrawing, is reducing a number of U.S. military in Europe? What kind of sign it is for them? How would they react, or how will they react in future?
I think this is sort of everything the Kremlin has been hoping for a very long time. If you go back to those ultimatums that the Kremlin put on the table before the full-scale invasion in December 2021, it was about removing the American troop presence from the newer members of NATO, from any members that joined after 1997. And, it could very well be happening just because of Trump. And so, whatever the reasons that people like Secretary of Defense Hegseth have for repositioning forces, whether they want more forces available to focus on China, whether they're trying to do budget cuts or realignments or whatever, the message that it sends at this point is that the trends are very favorable for Russia when it comes to European security. And so there's a reason to just wait and see what else the United States does to reduce its footprint in Europe, and that, the overall security environment in Europe will look even better for Russia maybe 6 months from now. So I think it sends a worrying signal about the American commitment to European security. And it sends a confusing signal, frankly, at the time when Trump is trying to, get Putin to agree to some sort of deal on Ukraine that is sustainable. It removes American cards, preemptively, whereas those could be held for leverage during a negotiation, and could be part of a more unified policy that shows American strength. And I think, unfortunately, it's showing the opposite.
In your opinion, Eric, what kind of what condition the negotiations between the United States and Russia are in the current moment? They had some meetings in Saudi Arabia. They were talking about ceasefire. They were talking about strengthening the mutual, diplomatic dialogue and so on. Is it a dead end right now? What can we say about it?
It's not a dead end. It's definitely proceeding. We had Kirill Dmitriev here in Washington last week as sort of Putin's personal envoy, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. And he, is here and meeting with people like Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's personal envoy. And so I have a sense that at a political level, the conversations are still ongoing, and that people in Trump's inner circle actually are pretty optimistic about the possibility of reaching some sort of major deal to reset the U.S.-Russia relationship and pursue some kind of economic and commercial deals in the future. But you're right that when it comes to, the hard security matters and a ceasefire and all of that, the conversations have been much more difficult. And yes, there was some sort of agreement in principle about an energy infrastructure ceasefire. Russia and Ukraine have been passing sort of no strike targets to each side, but I think Russia has been still striking a variety of targets, both energy and civilian infrastructure, and arguing, well, that wasn't on your list, so we're not violating the ceasefire. So maybe we won't hit this particular power station that you listed in the ceasefire documents, but we'll hit the substation, or we'll hit the management office, or we'll hit some other part of the infrastructure. And then you had the awful attack on Kryvyi Rih that killed several children. Again, I think Russia has shown very little interest actually in spirit in upholding a ceasefire. And so they're interpreting it very literally and trying to show the White House, okay, we're constructive, we're going along with your ceasefire proposal. Everything that the Ukrainians sent over, we're not striking, but then we have a free hand to do whatever else we want, which is obviously not the spirit of a ceasefire. So I think you still have a fundamental conceptual difference between what Trump expects and what the Russians are willing to do at this stage. And so I don't know if Trump is going to get angrier with Russia in the coming weeks. There was some maybe hinting of that last week when there were some comments that one of our American news outlets published where, Trump supposedly said he was pissed off with Putin. But I don't know. And at what level does that anger turn into actual action from the White House saying, okay, we're tired of Russian games, and now we're going to turn up the pressure? I think we'll have to see.
That's the real question. It would be really interesting what answer we're going to get on it. Well, what can you say about Russian strategy to proceed these negotiations with Trump's administration, with Rubio, with other guys from Trump's team? Well, we have Kirill Dmitriev, whose role is to play a good policeman, to please Witkoff and other Trump guys. and promised them that everything will be good, we'll be like having business together and so on. And we have former KGB guys and old-fashioned Russian diplomats on the other side of the table, like Yuri Ushakov, Lavrov, and we have Sergei Beseda, who is the former KGB guy. Well, actually, there's no former KGB guys. They are staying forever in those structures. And they are proceeding their negotiation track in much harsher way, really strict and hard, pushing on Rubio and Waltz and so on. So how effective Russians are in manipulating Trump and his administration? Because we can see now Trump's position and mood and rhetoric is changing from day to day. One day he is totally fine with Russians. He's saying that we are on our way to get a peace deal, to sign this deal and ceasefire. And another day he's pissed off with Putin. He's very angry. He's calling some TV hosts and complaining that everything's going sideways or in the wrong way. So what's happening? Actually, how successful Russians are in their game to manipulate Trump?
I think they have been actually very successful insofar as they have set the agenda and the terms of reference for the negotiation. Because this, the team of people around Trump had very little concept going into the talks in Saudi Arabia about what they even wanted. So they were just sort of listening to the Russian positions and sort of the Russian logic about the war. You had Steve Witkoff come out and do a bunch of interviews after the first set of talks in Riyadh, where he started talking about the Istanbul agreements from, the communique from March 2022 about Ukrainian neutrality and demilitarization and all of that, almost as if he had never heard about it until that meeting when the Russians told him about this Istanbul framework. And of course, from a very Russian standpoint of what it meant to them and how it needed to be the basis for talks, as Putin has said publicly. So you have a situation where many of these American negotiators have so little knowledge of the war and the reasons why it started and the strategic objectives that the Kremlin has been pursuing, so that they're very open to hear a Russian idea about the terms of negotiation. You have another issue here where, the Trump administration clearly does want some sort of ceasefire to come into effect. And the Russian side says, okay, sure, ceasefire, but we have to talk about the root causes of the war. That's the terminology that Putin likes to use. And for him, that means widening this from a conversation about just a ceasefire to issues about NATO presence, like we were talking about earlier, and make it a broader negotiation between the United States and Russia about the future of European security. And I think for the Trump team, they don't have enough experience yet dealing with Russians to say, okay, that's a trap. We want to go back and insist on our negotiating agenda, which is a ceasefire, period. And so, whether or not it's manipulation, I'm not sure, but I think there is a certain amount of like a blank slate from Washington, which can be filled with a lot of different, Russian narratives and views of the world that I think are ultimately pretty harmful certainly for Ukraine's interests, but also for American interests in Europe.
Got it. So if we talk about United States and Ukraine part of dialogue, what we should expect from the U.S.-Ukraine mineral deal? Is it still on the table? Is anyone in Washington still taking this deal seriously? Is there any use for Ukraine to sign this deal? Because as far as we know, Zelensky and his team are working hard to find some options to change this deal, to change this document, so it could be fine for Ukrainian side.
Yeah, I think it's still on the table. I think there are people in the Trump administration who are very interested in it. Um, I do think it's important for the Ukrainian side to reach a text which is acceptable, politically and morally to the Ukrainian side. I would say that the initial deal, when the Treasury Secretary brought it to Kyiv in February, was obviously very lopsided and skewed towards America. Then it was renegotiated, and the deal that Zelensky was going to sign when he came to the Oval Office for the now infamous meeting and the blow up with Trump and JD Vance, I think that was a much better deal because that was more of a cooperation framework, which didn't have any kind of repayment conditions or these really kind of stringent and very strange ideas about, American ownership of future Ukrainian mineral resources. It was more of a joint exploration and cooperation framework. That would have been very much in Ukraine's interest. Then, as far as I understand, the deal has been reimagined by the American side, and it's much more similar to the first iteration, which was very advantageous to the United States. And so, in its current form, again, I haven't seen any latest text, so I don't know. I imagine, your economy ministry is working very hard every day, and the lawyers in your government to sort of assert Ukrainian positions. But I think if it comes out looking more like the second version, which was a cooperation agreement, and it's very much, joint and mutual interests, then sure, I think it's very much to Ukraine's benefit to sign it.
And what exact benefits we are talking about right now? Because this deal doesn't guarantee any security for Ukraine. Trump insists that it guarantees the presence of American business in Ukraine. So that's enough for Putin not to attack Ukraine, but that's not true.
I agree with you, but I don't think that a hard security element can ever be part of this particular agreement on minerals. So I think it's part of maybe a suite of different agreements, which could come together over the series of coming months. And it could be a good foundation for Trump to say, okay, we're getting an economic benefit out of this going forward. It's not just a one-directional partnership where the United States is shipping all this weaponry. We will get something in return in the future, even if it's left a little bit undefined. And then, the United States and Ukraine can start negotiating some of these other agreements about continued military support, intelligence support, etc. So I wouldn't say that this is the only agreement or the final agreement or anything like that. It won't meet Ukraine's overall security objectives, but it won't harm them either. And it will provide a basis for further talks, and it's kind of a gesture of goodwill to Trump without hopefully very stringent conditions on the Ukrainian side.
Okay, so signing this deal should be Zelensky's first step right now to strengthen, to establish this dialogue with Trump's administration and continue to work to go on. What else Zelensky should do in the next, I don't know, few weeks or months to keep this dialogue with Americans?
I think Ukraine played its hand, let's say, very well in the talks in Jeddah, where Ukraine came across very constructive, interested in a ceasefire, very interested in American proposals. I think that strategy should continue, where Ukraine is seen as the constructive party, and it becomes clearer and clearer that Russia is the one getting in the way. And again, I think the Ukrainian side has done this very, very well over the past several weeks, and that's starting to. I do think that is starting to have an effect on the White House's thinking about the dynamics in the negotiations. The mineral deal, as you say, would be a good kind of political sign that the whole fight from the Oval Office has been patched up for the time being. But really, I think the main vector for Ukrainian foreign policy efforts at the moment should be directed towards Europe, because ultimately Europe is right now a more steadfast partner to Ukraine. There's some serious discussions underway about deployments, about training missions, about all Sky Shield, things like that. These are really serious discussions that were not happening for the first 3 years of the war. And I think because of Trump and the risk that he might abandon Ukraine, Europe has stepped up and started to have a really candid set of discussions about what they can do for Ukraine over the long term, for financing over multiple years, for defense industrial development to produce the kind of munitions and weapon systems that Ukraine will need, to invest directly in the Ukrainian defense industry like Denmark has pioneered, and now several other countries have joined this so-called Danish model. So I think that is as important direction of Ukrainian strategy in the next month or two as the direction towards Washington, and sort of making sure that there's a common European Ukrainian concept and theory of how a ceasefire could work, so that Ukraine and Europe are not seen as saying no to Trump's idea of a ceasefire, but instead they're seen as partners being able to help him, achieve this objective, but doing it in a way that actually advances Ukrainian security interests.
Good. And probably the last question, Eric, as far as we know, politicians in the United States really care about public opinion on different issues. And do we have any polls that can just tell us what kind of support, what level of support do we have for Ukraine among American voters, among American citizens? Do they support military aid for Ukraine or not anymore? How does this vary depending on political views and supporting Republicans or Democrats?
The latest polls I've seen show that there's still pretty strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, for sending weapons to, help Ukraine defend itself against Russia. Russia, Vladimir Putin, they're not popular in the United States. I mean, the percentage of Americans who sympathize directly with the Russian position is very, very, very small. But you do see a growing difference between how Democrats and Republicans, the voters, think about what the U.S. role should be. And so whereas there's still very strong support from Democratic voters and pretty strong from independent and centrist voters to continue sending large quantities of military aid to Ukraine, the levels among Republican voters have definitely started to decline. And again, it's not zero, and Republicans are not necessarily opposed to sending any. They just believe that America is doing too much, and maybe it should just do what is minimally necessary and have Europe do the rest, or there should be some sort of mechanism for financing of these weapons that isn't coming from American taxpayers. So I think you find a lot of Republicans who are sympathetic to the idea of maybe Europe paying for American weapons or using the frozen Russian central bank assets to pay for American weapons, things like that. Those narratives are coming particularly from the Republican side. But all in all, the support is still pretty strongly there in terms of sympathy for the Ukrainian position, desire to see Ukraine be able to defend itself against Russian aggression. And frankly, the salience of this issue, I mean, this is the big change. It's not really in the headlines anymore. And the headlines are much more about immigration, tariffs, things like that. And so for most American voters, this is not the main issue motivating them one way or another, which means that actually, politicians in Congress and so on have a lot of flexibility to design and propose policies and strategies and then argue to the American people why they're beneficial. When an issue is not so salient, people are willing to be persuaded of certain things, and it's not going to be something that gets them, protesting on the streets like we see in response to other, challenges to our legal system, for example, that are coming from the Trump administration. So overall, I think the public opinion trends in the United States are still pretty favorable to Ukraine.
Eric, thank you so much for your time, and this conversation was really interesting and eye-opening for me, and I hope to see you soon on our channel, maybe in a few weeks and months. So we'll see, and